Welcome back to the Secure AF podcast. This is part 2 of our New Year's resolutions, in which we cover the emerging topics in 2025 and the resolutions that we need to take to be cyber secure. I'm joined again here by Jonathan Kimmitt.
Hey, everybody.
Last week, we talked about some of the bigger ideas or bigger concepts, and this week, we really want to get into some of the more tangible specifics of threats that you're facing and things that you can do to address those threats. So, Jonathan, why don't you just kick it off with the first item on your agenda?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be data inventory. We've been talking about data. We've been talking about the new compliances, whether it be HIPAA, the new requirements for HIPAA or GOBA or FERPA or even CMMC. It really comes down to your data. Where is your data at? And honestly, this is what we're seeing in these incident responses. A machine gets compromised. We ask, okay, what kind of data was on here? And they will go, I don't know. Or it's like, how many records were on here? It's like, oh, I don't know. Well, if you think that that computer had records on it, you're kind of in a bind because now you have to, in most cases, you have to think about the worst possible case of how many records maximum could be on there. And you have to treat that as if they had gotten compromised. And so understanding where your data is at, where it's good, including your vendors. This is another one that we're seeing in recent recent incident responses. And that's a vendor gets compromised. So when I come in and I ask, what data do they have? And they go, well, we don't know. We know they had a lot of access to a lot of data, but we don't know what they actually had. Well, that's really problematic. So a data inventory. Now, the concept of data inventory really came around officially, I would say it came around much earlier than GDPR for things like HIPAA and FERPA and secretarial laws we have here in the U.S. But GDPR really solidified the concept of a data inventory, understanding what data you have. Where is it at? Where is it going? Your data flow diagram and your religion, which is different than your network diagrams. And that really confuses people. Where your data is coming in, where is it getting stored? Where is it being used and by whom? And how are you destroying it? That's your data inventory. So one of the things that, for 2025, we're kind of getting at a point where those organizations that did data inventories for GDPR, they're okay. Then you have a lot of organizations that just completely ignored it, and it's really hurting them. So one of the things for 2025 is having a good data inventory. Now, when I say that, everyone's like, what does that mean? Well, let's start simple. Number one, do you know what kinds of data are on your workstations? Whether it's a workstation in the office, a workstation that somebody takes home, whether it's a mobile device, a server, a third-party vendor, what data is on there? Are we talking about PII, confidential data, financial data? Do you have an idea of what kinds of data are on there? What is your policy for having data on the workstation or on a device or, a mobile device or a server? So those are things that are really important. So what I tell organizations that if they don't know anything about their data, best thing to do is do a broad swath, a broad sweep and go, okay, I know that HR has HR data. And so I'm going to mark those in my inventory, my physical inventory. And when I say physical inventory, this is, CIS number 1 is having a hardware inventory. You need to know every machine you have in your organization. Mark that as a field saying this machine has HR data in it. Now that's not very granular, but it starts with something. Do that for all of your machines. Get a broad sweep of understanding what kind of data is on there. Then you can go back and do a survey, go and ask you, create a questionnaire that you send to your departments. What kind of data do you have on your computer? Do you have first name, last name, date of birth, social security number, account numbers, whatever. You get that back. Now you're starting to build that data inventory, that real understanding of where your data is at. One of the questions on my questionnaire is, how many records do you have? They might say 1,000. They might say 10,000. They might say 1,000,000 records on the machine. If you find someone that says, yeah, I probably have 1,000,000 records on my machine, that's something you got to take serious. That's make sure it's bit locked. Make sure you've got multi-factor on it. Make sure you know what's on. Because if something happens to that machine, that's really going to hurt the organization. So those are some very specific things that organizations need to start doing. Now, this is across the board with all different kinds of data for all different kinds of laws. If you don't know what you have, you don't know what you need to protect. And that becomes a real problem, again, when you have an incident, because you kind of have to imagine worst case scenario at that point, because that's what the court's going to do. That's what someone who's going to sue you is going to do, is if you can't prove otherwise, and it's a reasonable thing to think that the HR had HR records on their computer, then you can get into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about this with the recent third-party vendor breach that affected Oklahoma schools. And different schools had different reactions. I know at least one school said they had intentionally, I think it was social security numbers and medical records were kept totally separate. So even though the third-party vendor was breached, and even though some data was exposed, they had taken the most critical data and made sure that that wasn't accessible.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a good example of thinking through what data do we need to have an extra layer of security. And if third-party vendor doesn't need that information, don't share it.
Well, a perfect example, I had a client very recently who said that they had a third-party vendor who asked for PII to be put into like a directory structure, like an Active Directory or an LDAP type thing, so that they could use it for validate or verification of identity. And I was really hesitant, to say the least. It's like, no, that data is not there right now. We don't really want to put it in there. Let's find a different way. But that's a very typical thing. One of the other things that I've done in the past is used honey records, where I'll create a unique record to put into that third party's data. And the idea is the data has to flow out to that third party in some way. So we put a record in there that is unique to that data. So if you find the data on the dark web and you find that record, you go, oh, that's the data that went to this third party vendor. And you know that's where it came from. So you have some sort of stamp or a watermark or something on there. It's just a honey record. But it can be really, really useful to find out where your data came from if it got, compromised out on the internet.
Yeah, that's certainly something we've seen in a lot of incident responses is companies or organizations not sure what information was where. And then I know one of the things that you've really worked with them on is, again, it's that worst case scenario. We don't think that type of data was on this host. Well, but if you don't know, and if it is possible, you have to go with the worst case scenario.
Oh, yeah. And I've butted heads with lawyers before because I had a lawyer who told me once that we can't prove that anything was taken. And I go, well, you can't prove that anything was not taken. And we went back and forth. And I understand their point of view. They were the customer didn't want data to be taken, but data was on the system. And to that extent, access to that data, whether it was accessed or not, or copyright, doesn't matter. Access to the data can trigger breach notification requirements for some states. So they really didn't like me making that argument. And I eventually won that particular fight because he couldn't argue it, but I don't understand why he was trying to. Our job is to look at what is the biggest risk to the organization. And to me, telling them the truth, making them understand that, hey, this is what is the worst case scenario for you. I hope it's not true. I really hope nothing happens, but my job is to explain the risks to you to the very, to the factual pieces. And that particular lawyer, who didn't, whatever his role was, he was doing it from the other direction. He was, hoping for the best, which I get that, but it leads to bad decisions sometimes when all you think about is the best case scenario. You have to understand what the worst case scenario is to see what real risk is.
So did you pull one of the phrases that a CISO needs to be able to say? Like, do you say, I'm smarter than you, or that's illegal? I'm just curious which one of those cards you pulled out in that situation.
I did pull one of those out while we were on the call. And I did it in a very professional manner. And fortunately, the client, at the time, he was texting me and we were discussing this, kind of separately because he was a CISO as well. I mean, he understood. And he himself was flabbergasted that the person had said such a thing. And I came back, I was like, no, I could not. My due diligence as an incident command or as a CISO is to make sure that the client is aware of the full breadth of the situation. And so I don't try to, I don't make it bigger than it is. I just make it more realistic of this is what could have happened. I can't prove that this data was not taken. I can't prove it was taken. I can show the data was taken. Here's the firewall logs. Which data? I have no idea. It could have been everything. It could have been nothing. So those sorts of things do happen. And, that's where you have conflicts. And that's where CISOs sometimes have to be the bad guy. They have to say things that people don't like hearing, but it's the job.
Yeah. Right. So data inventories are number one. What's the next thing you'd say?
Well, MFA. MFA is still a fight. I still find organizations that don't have it, who refuse to use it, or they're using something like SMS Messenger or something to that effect. Here's the reality. We have gone, I think it's 14 years now that we have had multi-factor authentication easily available to people. I mean, before that we had RSA tokens and stuff, but since Google Authenticator came out, Microsoft Authenticator, since all these things came out, we have had easy multi-factor authentication. We still have softwares that do not allow you to run multi-factor. So software as services or web clients or web portals and such. That's crazy. That is negligence. I know a lot of people don't like hearing that, and it's accusatory. This is, at this point in the world of cybersecurity, if you are not using multi-factor authentication, if you do not have it available and require it, you are negligent. Because I think one of our engineers looked it up the other day on Google, and he said that 98% of the current attacks are foiled by multi-factor authentication. Now, that's not 100% foolproof. Yes, you can bypass MFA sometimes. There's all kinds of different things, but just thinking about the fact that 98% of the current attack could be stopped with appropriate MFA, that in itself is a reason to implement MFA. I was talking to someone once here in the last 6 months or so, and they said that MFA is just too inconvenient.
Well, I always say any inconvenience for me is an inconvenience for the attacker. So when I have to pull out my phone and find my Google Authenticator code, it takes me a few seconds. I'm a little bit annoyed sometimes.
Sure.
But it means that the attacker on the other end isn't just annoyed, they actually can't get access. Yeah. So kind of reframing and saying, whatever is, anytime you feel an inconvenience, think about it as my inconvenience is actually a greater inconvenience for the attacker.
Yeah. Well, and think about it like this. If, let's say, an organization doesn't implement MFA, they choose not to because it's painful to, well, some of them don't do it because they don't have the technology. They're still around local Active Directory or local Exchange servers, whatever it is. And I tell them, like, if you're in court and you have somebody like me on the other side who says, Your Honor, multi-factor authentication has been around for 14 years. All modern operating systems as it relates to Mac or PC have the ability to do multi-factor with current technologies, 365 and federated identity and all this. This is not a difficult thing. It's a lazy and it's cheap because sometimes you have to upgrade licenses or whatever. Absolutely. You need to have multi-factor authentication. I don't think anybody could have an attack, not have multi-factor authentication, and defend in court the reason why they don't have it. They could say, yeah, it was just too costly for us. But at some point, that cost is part of doing business. It's to have a modern cyber system or a modern IT system, you really should have this multi-factor authentication. And it has to be modern. It can't be SMS messaging. SMS messaging is a terrible way of doing multi-factor. I know some people say, well, it's better than nothing. I get that. I understand it. It is better than nothing, but it was never designed to be secure. SMS messaging is not secure. There's a lot of different ways around it, and it's just a bad idea. So having modern multi-factor authentication in your organization for your applications and your workstations and your servers and your management networks, which honestly is exactly what cybersecurity insurances are now requiring, is MFA across the board. That's what a lot of the new requirements. Somebody was talking to me about some new requirements that came out for different frameworks. And they said, well, you got to have, all you need is 8 characters and this and that. I was like, hold on, let's read all of it. And it talks about MFA, it talks about this, it talks about these things. So you can't take bits and pieces. You got to do all of it to be secure. So this is one that I can't believe that in 2025 we're still fighting this. Multi-factor. Now, it's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. And eventually the multi-factor is probably going to move away to something else. But right now, with the attacks that we have and the technology that we have, MFA is one of the best deterrents and one of the best methods of protecting your data and your systems. And really, people just need to do it. If you are in 2025 not implementing federated identity with multi-factor authentication, you are really behind. And you're behind into a point in which if a compromise happens, I hate to say it like this, but those system administrators could probably be held personally responsible for them, personally liable, because it's too easy. They almost have to turn this stuff off of these different systems. So I say don't do it. I say implement it, because it protects you, it protects the organization, it protects your employees. It's just a better idea.
What do you think about the systems that allow you, for example, if you don't have access to your authenticator, to try another way, and that is an SMS text?
Uh-oh. No, because, that's what the attackers are going to do.
Right.
In fact, I was helping somebody not too long ago. They were trying to get back into their own account because of something that happened. And I go, okay, well, if the attacker changed the MFA, try getting in this way. And they tried. It didn't work. The attacker went in. But that's exactly what the attackers are going to do. They're not going to go through so here's an example. If you have the Authenticator app, really hard to attack, by the way, but I can do it through SMS messaging, I'm going to try the SMS messaging first, whether it's a SIM swap attack or something, or maybe it might just bombard you with it and hope you click yes. So, those sorts of things, yes, it could be that is the attack method of the attackers. Why? I guess my question to anybody that's thinking about that is, why would you leave a vulnerable system? It's kind of like, well, we're going to use the modern Office 365, but we're going to leave IMAP and SFTP available in case you need to get in there last minute or whatever. But no, don't do that. That's a bad idea. So now here's the downside. It's very possible that an attacker gets into your account and locks you out of it, and you're just screwed. Yeah. You have to protect your credentials, protect your MFA, protect everything. because the whole point is to lock the account down.
Mhm.
And if somebody were to get in there and change all that stuff, it's really hard to go back and get it.
Yeah. Well, well, all right. So we've covered data inventory, MFA. What's next on your hit list?
Hit list. I like that. It is backups. And this is still, backups have been a thing. In fact, I remember back, it was probably 15 years ago, where somebody made the comment that they didn't have backups, they just had files because the backups were corrupted. It's like, oh, and it wasn't even useful files. It was just, you have a bunch of files. Backups are still an issue. And this comes from a lot of different things. Recently, we've had incidents where the attacker went in and just deleted all the backups, across the board. Well, that sucks. We had some where they didn't know how to recover from the backups. They taking backups, but they had never recovered from the backups. They don't back up everything, so they could not back up to full production. I mean, there's all kinds of different things. So here's what I recommend to people: you need to take your backups. You need to take a copy of those backups and make sure you air gap them. Or there's a lot of different terminologies that people use. I use air gap, but what I mean by that is you don't want that backup to be able to be deleted by anybody that has access to your domain admins, your network, whatever. This is the equivalent of sending your tapes to like Iron Mountain or something like that. It's completely offline. There's no way for somebody to get in there and delete that stuff. So that's the way.
Or gain persistence on the backups. So you clearing up your system, restore from backups, and good. They've just got access again.
Yes, exactly. So having some sort of technology, there's a lot of different kinds of technology. There's immutable backups, there's air gap backups, there's offline backups, there's a lot of different names for it. I call it air gap. But what I mean by that is you need to have a backup that is offset, that you can't delete, that maybe you have to call someone else and delete it, or that you need to go somewhere else and delete it, or you need to delete the what would we equate to tapes, get rid of the tapes. There's a technology out there now that it just takes 2 people to delete a system. And I questioned that. It's kind of like the old nuclear launch thing. Both people turn the keys. This is the same kind of that. And I said, well, what accounts have access to that? And they go, oh, well, this account and this account. I was like, oh, can I reset both those accounts if I'm domain admin? They go, well, yeah, but you would know which 2 accounts. It's like, well, that's fair. I mean, I probably wouldn't, but I could reset those passwords and get in and log into the system and change. They go, well, yeah, you could. It's like, okay. I just want to be realistic with my risk. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it, but it is something to think about. So that's the first thing I tell people to do for the backups is make sure it's truly air gapped or, offline or something to where that the attacker can't delete it or get rid of it. Well, party manage is fine. The other thing, and when I say management, they have complete management. You can't touch it as part of your organization. The other thing I tell people to do is you must, absolutely must, test your backups to full production. A lot of people, their tool will test it and they'll give you the, okay, it's good, it's a good backup. That's not what I mean. I mean, if you have a system, a production system, that if that system were to die, that you have all of the steps and all the procedures and all the process, it will take the backup file, bring it back to full production, and people start using it. You know how to do it. You know how long it's going to take you to do it. You know all the dependencies on it. You've tested it. And here's what I recommend people do. Take one of your systems, on a Friday afternoon, take your final Delta backup, turn it off or disconnect it or snapshot, whatever. Your backup process, recover from your backups from all the way to a file to either bare metal or bare VM and bring it back up. Start using that backup as your production. Make sure by Monday that you're fully functional with the backup version. and then you continue on for a few days, delete your original ones. That way you know how to bring this back up scratch. How do you bring it back up? Now, if there are some cases where you've got to bring this stuff back on new hardware. So get you some new hardware. Take your last deltas. All right. Timing starts now. Reinstall VMware. Do this. Reinstall your backups. Do that. Take your dependencies. Start getting your Active Directory, your DNS, your DHCP, all these things. Bring them all back up. Get it back into production. How long does it take you? What are the processes? Have you got it down in your playbook, which we're going to talk about in a little bit? Those are the things. Take your backups, bring them all the way back to production. And if you can't, well, figure out why. You know, what's wrong? What dependency did you forget? What process did you forget? Does it just not work? We had that happen once. They were taking backups. Backups were running. Backups were testing. We pulled the data, fully corrupted. Their backups was just broken. I don't know why. It was just broken. And here's the thing. The whole point of bringing your backups is because bad things happen. This person sat there and he probably beat on his backups for 16, 18, 20 hours. And they were just corrupted. He didn't know why. And so I asked him, when did you test this? Well, never tested it. Well, it's a new system. I was like, how long have you had it? For 2 years. That's not a new system. Now, one thing I have heard is people, they say, well, we've recovered files off of it. We had to go back and get this file. That is not production. You know, you're bringing the file structure up, great, and you're going to get something. That's great. That is a test, but that is not production. That is, you have tested it a little bit, but you haven't tested it production. And that's the one thing that I don't really understand is if you have these tools, and some of these backup tools are great. I mean, they're very powerful. But if you've never tested a full production, then you really just have a bunch of files that might be functional. You don't know. So test them. Now, hey, if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 critical functions, and they're supported by 5 or 6 or 7 critical servers, you need to test each one of those servers to full production at least once a year. So maybe every 2 months, you set aside the time on a Friday afternoon, you snapshot it, you delta it, you take it down, you bring it from backup, you get it back up and running by Monday. That's where your testing comes in. That's where you truly know that you can bring this back up to full production.
Well, I was kind of thinking about an example where it worked well. We were doing a tabletop with a bank, and, you know, for our tabletops, we usually plan pretty much a full day.
Uh-huh.
So we showed up, started going through it, and of course, part of that is, you know, your backups are corrupted or things like that. And this was actually a pretty short tabletop because not only did they have pretty good security, but then they did have several layers of backups.
Right.
Which they had tested. So it was like, okay, well, if this backup goes down, we can do this, but not this. Okay, if we have to go to the air gap backups, we'll be able to do these things, but not these things. So they actually knew what they'd be able to bring it back on quickly. Yeah. And then also had a timeline for, okay, since we know that there's XYZ we won't be able to do, we also know that then this will get us immediately restored to these systems, and within 3 days, we can have full production backup.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, the engineer who's doing the tabletop was like, okay, well, and had some other things to do with them, but it was just a great example of they were really solid. And because they had those backups in place, even though there was a threat actor, you know, who got into the system, they were able to remediate it pretty well.
Yeah. Well, and that shows me they're a very mature environment as it relates to incident response. They either have somebody that's really paranoid, like me, or they've had lots of incidents, so I hope not, but they're very mature in their processes. And
the IT guy was paranoid.
Yeah. Well, and that's what you have to be, because, I mean, think about it. You know, if he knows that those backups are 3 days, but when I, as a CISO, go ask a department, well, how long can you be without this critical function? And they go, well, we can't be more than 24 hours or people will die. Okay, well, now as a CISO, I have a 24-hour time limit or people die. And that's not uncommon, by the way. I mean, I have many customers that they have limits like that where people will die, whether it be a hospital or prison or it. So at 24 hours, that's super critical. They got to have an alternative up or a mitigating control up or whatever. Then I go and ask the backup person and they say, well, we have tested it. Takes 3 days to get this from scratch. Okay. So one of two things has to happen. I either have to go and change the mitigation from the department's point of view, so they can go for more than 24 hours, or I provide more resources to my backup team for them to be able to get it under 24 hours. So that conversation really has to take place, but you have to know. I mean, if I go into an organization, like, how long does it take you to bring this back up? It's like, we don't know. A week? Okay, how long can you be down? And they're like, we can be down for 4 hours. Well, there's a disconnect there and there's a problem. But that's super important to really understand, and need to understand where your backup team is at, or your security team, or whoever's doing that, and where they're at in terms of their skill sets and playbooks, i.e. the next thing, or the last thing we're talking about. But then those things, because if you don't know, you can't prepare for anything.
Yeah. I said paranoid, but I think you've used the term healthily paranoid, which I think is just the idea, right? This is serious. Serious things can happen.
Yeah.
Think about it in the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And now design your systems and your processes and your playbooks and everything around the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And then test for the worst case scenario.
Yeah. And I call it professionally paranoid. That's my job.
Yeah. Oh, I like it.
Be paranoid. Oh. Yeah. Professionally paranoid. But yeah, absolutely. That's what you have to think about. And when I do my tabletops, I've got a range of tabletops that I like doing of different kinds and different topics and stuff, and I have a lot of fun with them. But the problem, the reason why I like the tabletops is because that's how I live my life. Mm-hmm. I'm constantly thinking, okay, what would I do in this situation? How am I going to do this? I mean, I do it with my family. I think I've said on the podcast before, but here a few months ago, we had a tabletop, a family tabletop, where I pulled the plug, the power to the house, and we lived like that for 12 hours or 10 hours or something like that. And the whole point was, okay, if this happens, how do we maintain the fridges? How do we cook? How do we maintain, communications and charge our laptops and whatever? And we learned a few things. We were pretty prepared. We were fine. And I have effectively 3 teenagers. They're not quite teenagers, but they act like it. So I had to live with 3 teenagers and my wife and I, no power for 10 or 12 hours. So
also checking if the children don't go feral.
Exactly. And what I told my wife is like, well, I've got a tent, so her and I can just go hang out in the backyard in a tent and the kids can have the house. But we did this tabletop, and when I talk about it, people are like, you do tabletops with your family? Well, sure. I mean, how else are you going to test your processes? How else are you going to make sure that what you think will happen will actually happen? I mean, as my kids get a little older, in fact, my oldest is probably now, she's going to learn how to change tire oil, and she's got to learn. I was driving into work the other day, and I had to change my tire on the side of the road in the cold. It was cold that morning too, in the dark. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on the side of the road. I effectively had a blowout. Well, I gotta go change the tire. And I want to make sure that if that ever happens to my kids, they go, okay, well, let's get out, let's get around, let's get lights up, let's get the spare out, if the car even has a spare, and let's get it changed. I want them to have that experience and know they can do it before they ever have to do it. And that's what being tabletop or having tabletops are, why you do them, is to make sure you're prepared for those. So as an organization, if you don't know how to bring up your backups, it's like not knowing how to change a tire. You're going to have a blowout, and you're going to sit there and go, all right, what do I do? And that's a bad place to be.
Yeah, definitely not ideal.
Right.
So where would you take us next?
I'm going to say updates. So validating your updates. So this is something that it's really hard to imagine a time frame now with all the tools we have available to us.
Yeah.
They have organizations that don't validate their updates. They don't test to see if their updates have actually gone out to the workstations. I ran into this years and years ago. In fact, some of the stories that I've told is one of them was I went in and looked at the organization. We did went to Windows updates. We checked for updates and it said no updates available. Great. Then I looked down the list and I was like, those updates are several years old. That's odd. Hey, can you go to your WSUS server, their update server at the time? I was like, can you pull me a report of all the updates that have been approved or denied in the system? And they go, yeah, sure, we can do that. They went to the WSUS and they tried to log in. They couldn't log in. And they're like, well, there's something going on. It's like, okay, well, go reboot it or whatever. So they went and rebooted it and they got in. That's like, I want to see when the last person that logged into this machine was. And it was a year and a half. They hadn't logged into that machine for a year and a half. Okay, we'll go look at the law or the logs. The machine had probably locked up a year and a half ago. That means no updates were being pushed. Nothing was happening. But as far as the clients were concerned, they were checking in. No new updates were available. And I'm like, this is crazy. We have to catch up. Okay, you do not deploy a year and a half worth of Windows updates at the same time. You don't do it to servers. You don't do it to workstations. It took them almost 2 years to get caught up. And they did it in a very systematic way because you had to deploy updates, do patches on the softwares, and do all these different things. So it took them about 2 years. But one of the things I dinged them on was nobody was checking the updates. Now, at the time, what I made them do is, someone in IT had to log in every single month to that server. Number one, make sure it's running. Number two, to approve updates. Now, security updates and critical updates were pre-approved. And that's actually what they were banking on is, we'll just pre-approve all these, just let it go. No, you can pre-approve them, that's fine. But you need to you need to go in and look at it and pull the reports to make sure it's actually going out. So once a month, they went in, they had to pull these reports, they had to look to make sure what got patched, what didn't get patched, pull the reports and present it to me as a CISO to validate that these things were going out. A couple years later, we were able to get a vulnerability scanner, a Nessus client. And then I started validating it externally from the system. So we would run patches. And then a month later, I would run an authenticated vulnerability scan and look to make sure that these machines were actually getting their updates. So it's the WSUS server was telling us one thing, and then I would validate it with something else. And that's what I still tell people to do, is they need to have some sort of update process, whatever that is. They can be running Windows services to do those updates. They could manually update them if they want, depending on how big the organization is. They could be running a tool like, I don't know, Avanti or something like that to update their system. That's perfectly fine. But they need to run reports. They need to validate it in the system. But then you also need to validate them externally. So get a vulnerability scanner, have a service come in and do the scan for you. Even if it's once a quarter, once a month is better, but even if it's once a quarter, run a vulnerability scan and make sure you look through it and go, I really thought these machines got their updates, but these vulnerabilities aren't patched. You can go back and you can figure out what the problem is. Again, when I asked that first time, they go, yeah, here, double click, Windows Update. All updates are good. And it wasn't. So validating your updates. So many problems can be fixed by just making sure your machines are up to date. And that's the easy stuff. That's making sure if your Windows are patched, your operating systems are patched. That's the easy things. If you can get that fixed, then you can focus on the harder things and the harder problems to fix. And so Windows updates, operating system patches, Those are super critical. Make sure that you've got a good tool to do it. Make sure you check the logs on it. And then make sure you have an external source validation of vulnerability scan. And there are some free vulnerability scanners out there that are okay. I like the tools, the professional tools that are out there. They're good tools. Well, what I like is just having that external validation, scan and check to make sure those patches are going to go on to the machines and block those vulnerabilities.
I would say that's one of the things that we see the most frequently when we go in to do a pen test or an Active Directory audit or anything like that. Is just the number of hosts that are running an outdated operating system. And often clients aren't aware of that. Like, oh, we didn't know we had these machines on the network.
Yeah.
Okay, well, sometimes that just means you don't need them anymore, or it means let's go figure out what we need to do to update them.
Sure. Well, and that's exactly what happens when you have your data in or your hardware inventory. If somebody brings up to me their hardware inventory and I look at it, if I'm doing an audit, okay, I'm going to scan their network and I'm going to, okay, this is what I see. It needs to generally match what you have in your data inventory, give or take, let's say 5%, because machines go off and on and whatever. But there are times, in fact, the one time I did it, he gave me his spreadsheet and there was, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000, whatever. And I scanned and I saw like 5,000 devices. And I handed it to him and I was like, this is what I'm scanning. And he goes, what are all these devices on my network? And well, there was a lot of things to it to increase the number, but it was a huge surprise to him. He didn't think that there was that many devices on his network.
All right, so what would be our next item that we need to make a resolution about?
So this is the one where we actually talked about it a couple of times, and that is your playbooks. All too often, people are not building their playbooks. They don't know how to deal with situations that they're going to run into during an incident response. Now, I'm big into tabletops. I teach tabletops. I want people to do tabletops. You have done tabletops with me out for clients. I think they're a huge tool to the organization. It really helps them understand where they're at. But what comes out of tabletops is actually the playbooks, and those playbooks of understanding how do you do this thing. So here's an example. If your firewall is dead, how do you bring it up again? How do you rebuild it? Where is it physically located at? That was a problem I had with the client. I walked in, I was like, hey, where's your firewall? Well, we don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, it's in the data center. Great. Where's it at? We don't know. We're all new. I'm like, okay, that's fair. Let's go in and find it real quick. But they didn't even know. They don't know where passwords are at. They don't know what network you need to be plugged into to get access to. You know, where the console had one. They didn't even have a console cable. They had no console cable for their equipment. So they couldn't console into a switch, or they just misplaced. It's like, okay, well, that's a problem. So all these different things, you work them out in your playbook. Your playbook in that case would be, here's where you find your console cables. They're located in this spot. This is where you find passwords. This is where it's physically located. This is who normally manages it. This is where the configuration is. This is how you reboot it. This is how you reload it. This is how you reload it from scratch. If you have to rebuild from new, here are your steps. All of that should be in playbooks. Now, that's just an example, but you also have communication playbooks, you have compliance playbooks, you have backup playbooks, you have all these different things. You have a playbook for playbooks, actually. You know, I tell people, you need to have a list of all your playbooks. Where are they at? Who manages them? Where is the latest copy of it? That is critically important, because all too often, I go in, network is down, like, all right, where's your incident response policy? It's on the share that's down. Okay, where's your playbooks? Oh, it's on SharePoint, but all authentication is down. Okay, let's talk about IR binders. And actually, I have a binder that I use as my sample when I teach binders for people, incident response. But push comes to shove, I can use my binder. It has most things in it. Now, it's not exactly right, because everybody's environment is there, but it's got communication playbooks, it's got incident command playbooks, it's got some firewall, it's got incident log tracking, it's got all this stuff. I have something to start with, and I can use it. Um, I am huge into the playbooks, mostly because I want people to test their stuff, use the tools, use the processes, make sure they work. And then when they don't, figure out how to make them work, because during an incident, you're not going to have time to figure it out. You've got the board down your throat saying, when is this coming back up? You need to know, like you said earlier, it's going to take 3 days to get this back up. Okay. That is a set expectation because you've practiced it, you've tried it, you've tested it, and this is what it's going to be. During an incident, you need to have that information. And the only way to do that is to do your tabletops, do your training, and make sure you have it in your playbooks.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said, is it's always testing. Like, that's fine to have a playbook. Does it work? Or, one of the things in a tabletop is part of it's not just the incident, but you're also trying to show what happens when the plan that you have to recover from the incident is also messed up. So, you talk about enjoying killing people in tabletops. And part of that is if your incident response says, well, everything goes through this person, and you say, great, that person has the flu. That person, whatever. Yeah. They go, oh, well, now we don't. Okay, well, you just identified a place. You have got to.
You just said,
here's your point. Here's your point of failure. Now go back and think about the whole playbook. Where are the other points of failure and how do you mitigate those?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, our office just dealt with a lot of people sick. Mm-hmm. The flu, influenza A or something has been going around. We had people out. And then we had, all right, well, how do we cover for them? And building those processes. And we had a pretty good process to make sure everything was covered. But that's something to think about. I always talk about the food poisoning. Mm-hmm. That's happened where you bring in dinner for your incident response team and then everyone gets food poisoning from it. How do you deal with that? Well, the person's never had to deal with it. It's like, okay, we're bringing in multiple restaurants and people get to choose one, but not everyone can choose the same one. You all get to tacos, pizza, hamburgers. All of you pick one, but that's the only thing you can eat. You can't be mixing and matching because I don't want everybody taken out because of food poisoning. Because if everyone gets taken out, well, then the incident response is just dead. It's just,
right.
Well, everyone's in the bathroom and don't have anything to do. So, but those little things like that, you test those. That's now part of my injects for my tabletops is I will absolutely do this. Like, all right, this half of the room, you can't answer any questions. You have food poisoning. And I go back to this side of the room. All right, what about this? Well, that person doesn't. That person's not here. How do you do this? Who do you ask? Where do you go? And it can be a lot of fun. I did have a recent tabletop where we were doing, the CEO was in there, which I always love having senior leadership in there. And we got done with our warm-up exercise. This is the simple exercise. And she goes, I'm going to go throw up in my office now. And I'm like, oh, okay. She goes, I thought we were doing really good. And he just bombed it. It's like, well, you didn't bomb it, but that's the whole point. If the tabletop doesn't test you, then you're not really testing your procedures.
Well, and it's funny because I would think an organization would think, okay, but that's crazy. That's never going to happen. And then I remember one of the interesting stories is that I think it was February 2020. Helios was doing a tabletop for someone, and the scenario they picked was that there's a pandemic.
Yeah.
And here's what happens. That company came back and they said, because it's February, March, it happened.
Yeah.
And they said, so did you know something? I'm like, no, we just picked a scenario and actually thought we picked one that was kind of crazy. Like, we're just going to go big. And then it happened. And so ironically, this one organization was like, yeah, we kind of knew what we'd do because we'd actually walked through this tabletop of this crazy scenario. And so I think helping, again, it's that what's the worst case? Okay, have your tabletop test the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
So that you know how to mitigate that. And then more minor scenarios, of course you can mitigate because you're prepared for the worst one.
Sure. Absolutely. My daughters, they think dad thinks very dark things. It's like, yeah, that'll never happen, or all these different things. But the reality is that stuff does happen, and I have to think about the worst case scenario so I can defend against it. My first aid kit, I kid you not, my first aid kit in the house is a Pelican 1510 case. It's a carry-on case, so it's big enough to be a full-size carry-on. And I've got all kinds of different things in there. I've got Band-Aids and antibacterial, and I've got things like, all kinds of, I got ice packs and plastic suture things, like butterflies, but they pull the skin. I got everything, blankets. And my wife was she was at a friend's house, and they had a thing. They had an incident where there was lots of bleeding and whatever, and no one else had what we had in our first aid kit. And I didn't even have everything I wanted in there in that situation, because it was a travel kit. It was in the back of her car, so it's about this big, about that thick for the first aid kit. But after that, by God, I went on Amazon and I bought stuff to put in there. It's like, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that's in there from that point forward. And so I added stuff to the kit after that incident happened. Because, it didn't occur to me that particular ad thing would happen. And I want to make sure that our stuff is ready for it.
Yep. I think those any other things for our New Year's resolutions?
Oh, I think I've depressed the people enough. We cover some big ones, and these are big ones. These are not simple things to accomplish. This is a full year's worth of effort to put into a 2025, things to do. So, but I think these are the big ones. We've got the data inventory, the MFA, testing your backups, validating your Windows updates, and building your playbooks and doing tabletops. Those are huge, but the payoffs are huge. If you can do all of these things, it just makes so much sense, and it protects the organization so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, and absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Those are some cybersecurity tips for 2025. Reach out to us if you have questions. We'd love to talk, and I hope everyone has a very secure 2025. So we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.